Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm Hilary Salt.
And we're joined today by a China expert. I think that's the best way of summing our guest up.
That sounds so impressive as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, an expert on a pretty important country. So welcome, William Matthews.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So just let's start off by saying what attracted you to China in the first place? How did you get involved in China?
Sure. So it was actually in my last year of school. I had a classmate who decided that he wanted to go to China to teach English, and he wanted someone to go with him. And he asked me if I wanted to do it, and they would pay for sort of flights and accommodation and things like that. So I said, well, why not? I'd never really thought about China before doing that, but I did that, and now I've spent my whole professional life doing stuff to do with China. So
Did
quite
you
a fateful decision.
Did you end up working out there?
So I did a bit of volunteer teaching out there a couple of times, but didn't work out there. But I've spent time there studying Chinese and doing research on various subjects, including in academia, which I used to be involved in.
So you don't just pick up Chinese, do you? It must be quite intensive study.
Yeah, I started learning it as evening classes here, and that's not a very good way to do it when you're just sort of spending an hour a week trying to learn a language that's so totally different from any European language. So it needed that time sort of fully immersed in it in Beijing to get somewhere with it. Yeah.
How long do you think it took you to really grasp the language?
Hard to say. I guess I've been doing evening classes for about 3 years or so before I actually went to study it in China, and in that, like, that had got me to the point where maybe I could like get a taxi or something.
Okay.
Probably not really understand sort of anything the taxi driver would say to me. But being immersed in it, I was actually quite lucky because the university where I was studying was mostly was all international students, but mostly not from English speaking countries. So actually we had to speak Chinese to communicate with each other in the first place. So that was really good. So I'd say kind of a year of that and then a few sort of follow-up visits got me to the point where I can use it in a professional context.
Do you think China is the most important country politically or geopolitically for the UK in terms of our foreign policy?
In terms of our foreign policy overall, I'd say it's not the most important. I would say the most important single country is probably the United States. But China is extremely important, and it's important now, and it will be more important in the future. Happy to go into that. But what I will say is that China comes up a lot in sort of discussions of questions like economic dependencies and things like that. At the moment, we're actually, as a country in the UK, much more economically dependent on the United States. But China is important because even though we don't trade as much with them as we do with the US or with Europe, they control a lot of materials, processing, manufacturing upstream on a lot of important supply chains. So a lot of the things that we are trading with other countries, actually, China might have influence that over that further up.
And I guess one of the things that we find in the West is that people have very polarized views about China. So when Rachel Reeves kind of announced her desire to increase our trade with China, a lot of people felt uncomfortable about that. A lot of people thought that was fantastic. What's your view?
Yeah, I think really in this country, we've been quite slow in really starting to think seriously about China. And part of the result of that is the political discussion about China, whether that's in parliament, whether that's in the media, is really quite simplistic. Much more simplistic than the kind of political debate and discussion we have about Europe or about America, or other sort of key important countries. And yeah, it's polarized. It's either straightforward economic opportunities or terrible human rights and oppression. And in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. The country itself is more complicated than that. It's a country of 1.4 billion people. It is run by a communist party. It's a one-party state, but at the same time, it's not North Korea. That's not a government that has total control over all aspects of life. Um, it's a country that is actually quite, from the point of view of outcomes economically and for people's lives and so on, it's actually quite well governed. Um, and it's really important globally in terms of economics, in terms of international security, in terms of things like climate change, food security, energy security. And the reality is that we have to engage with China. They produce about a third of the world's manufacturing output at the moment. They control all sorts of critical supply chains, like critical minerals that go into emerging technologies. And increasingly, they keep pace with America in technologies like AI and robotics as well. So there's no way of ignoring them. So actually, there needs to be a bit more of a complex and nuanced conversation about how the UK can engage effectively.
Can you give us a bit of the background on China, a bit of the sort of the recent history? You know, I'm sure a lot of people will know that China was a very, very poor country up until maybe 40 years ago, and has sort of seen this huge increase in wealth. And people will have talked all my life about we're entering the age of China. And I think some of those predictions were accurate, some maybe less so. Can you just give us a sense of the history of the last 50, 60 years?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, the People's Republic of China, so that is China as run by the Communist Party, was founded in 1949 under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And he was a totalitarian dictator. He had a huge amount of control. Um, he also pursued sort of very, very aggressive communist policies that caused, among other things, the largest famine in history, between, depending on the estimates you look at, 30 to 60 million people died in China under his rule. And he left China when he died in 1976 in serious poverty and political chaos. Since then, there's been a succession of leaders still committed to the authority of the Communist Party, but who have been much more pragmatic when it comes to economic policy. Deng Xiaoping, who became the kind of the key leader after Mao, he gave people the opportunity basically to start setting up businesses, to pursue free enterprise. Did that in quite a sort of cautious and controlled way, but that really started off this period of massive economic growth for China. And then sort of since then, that's continued, but by about, I guess, about 2010 or so, China had really moved on quite a lot, and it was not only sort of just a big country starting to develop quickly, but actually one of the major economic powers. And now it's a country where, certainly in the richer areas on the East Coast, you've got a comparable standard of living to a lot of sort of countries in, say, Eastern Central Europe. You've still got large areas of the country where there is poverty, where people are poorer, but the mood and the sense is still of kind of a dynamism of moving forward. And China has gone from being a country that was associated with kind of cheap, low quality manufacturing and stealing Western technology to one that now is producing cutting edge AI models like DeepSeek, is the world's leader increasingly in robotics, has a military that is, getting on to comparable with that of the USA in terms of technology. So that's kind of the last 50 years. What I will say quickly is that it's worth putting it actually in the long view as well, which is that until China, until the late 18th, early 19th century, when China, and then in the 19th century, when China encountered industrialized Britain, and that sort of precipitated a period of decline where it couldn't compete. It had internal problems as well. But actually, for most of history, China has been one of the richest and most powerful countries in the world, and that's over periods of centuries and millennia. It's always been very advanced, very powerful, and very rich. And so, in some ways, this is kind of a return to a more of a historical norm.
Can I ask a question that might be stupid? So forgive me if it is, but we describe China as a communist state. But I was reading a thing in the FT about electric vehicle manufacturers, and it was saying that some of those manufacturers have become insolvent. And I'd kind of imagine that if you're not organising companies on a profit motive, you wouldn't get things like that. So, I mean, is there a market? How does competition work? How does all that work in a inverted commas communist society?
Yeah, so China, I mean, in terms of the economics, has not been communist for, well, really since the death of Mao, actually, in sort of absolute terms. What you do still have is heavy state involvement in the economy. You have a lot of state-owned enterprises, and you do have a situation where actually big companies there'll be party members and party committees within those companies, and the state will intervene in things like, major sort of international deals and things like that. But on the grassroots level and within China, there is free enterprise and there is a market. It's just a market which is sort of subject to a fairly high degree of state direction and intervention.
And is state capitalism a good description for it?
Yeah. That I mean, that's a sort of a common term that's used to describe it. And I think that makes sense. Yeah.
So I think it seems to me that there was this prediction maybe 20, 30 years ago that economic development went hand in hand with liberal democratic values. Does China disprove that?
Yes, I think so. I think China has thoroughly demonstrated that that is not necessary. And actually, one of the things that I think China has demonstrated as well is that there are non-democratic models for governing society that actually can be extremely successful. Successful economically, successful in delivering for people's well-being and so on, assuming that you bracket out any concern for sort of participation in a political process. In a lot of ways, actually, China's system is arguably better adapted for the current world than the systems that we have in Europe and the United States. And that's not actually because it's not democratic or because we're democratic. It's because China's a rising power, and because of that, as it's developed, it's been able to find niches that are being ignored by the developed countries and build institutions and build sort of strategies that can exploit those. And they've done that very effectively.
What kind of niches?
So this would include, I mean, various kinds of examples. Some of these are economic niches, some of these are technological niches. You mentioned electric vehicles. That's a really good example of where basically the Chinese government saw that, about 10, 15 years ago, they sort of anticipated that electric vehicles were going to be something important in the medium to long term. They set out to basically guide the market and guide businesses in China through things like subsidies and so on to start innovating in that area, start developing that technology, and also buying up mineral processing and extraction and material and component manufacture, and basically controlling the whole supply chain. They've done similar things with AI, for example. They sort of recognized an opening there where, AI is this new thing. People don't really know how to govern it. It's this whole game-changing technology, creates all these problems, sort of politically, of how you manage it. They set out in 2017 actually a comprehensive plan for governing AI, and they've been following that since. And that was a time when actually most Western governments weren't even thinking about it. And that, I think, is a good example of where, say a Western government has a lot of entrenched institutions that have existed for decades. That can create a certain degree of stagnation and lack of flexibility in finding new solutions. And actually, in terms of institutions and governance, China's been quite effective at that internationally, in cultivating support in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, because they can find that, they can see, as a developing country themselves, where there are gaps, where there's an opportunity to offer things that these countries would find useful, including things like a different kind of model of economic development and governance that's not provided by the US and Europe, who tend to peg things to human rights records and things like that, which are obviously often not of interest to governments across the developing world.
Can you just explain a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative? Because I was in Tajikistan and I saw it, a small part of it happening. We had all of these Chinese workers staying in the same hotel as us. And it was funny because the local Tajik owners, they had to learn Chinese cuisine because they said the workers don't want to eat our food. They want Chinese food.
Yes. Okay. So that sort of thing is quite a common story from a lot of countries where kind of China has developed stuff. Part of it has been that actually, there have been promises of, or the potential for local jobs and opportunities, but actually it hasn't been that. It's been bringing in Chinese workers who then sort of build things, then move on, or continue to manage it themselves. But the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, this is a description of basically a major set of international infrastructure projects and economic projects that China has pursued with various partner countries mostly across the developing world, but also in some cases with countries in Europe as well. With an
Italy,
aim
right?
of, sorry?
There was a project with Italy, is that right?
Yes, yeah. So Italy was a member and has since left the initiative. But the idea of it, was twofold. One was that China had a huge amount of kind of excess capacity for building infrastructure, and too many workers and companies basically working in infrastructure development, and this was a way of sort of exporting that, and also excess capital as well. But the other part of it was also to build geopolitical influence. So basically, what China has done through the Belt and Road Initiative is do things like build railways, road networks, telecoms networks, things like that, ports, in partner countries. And that has basically not necessarily always been economically and financially useful for China, but what it has done is basically build up partnerships with all those countries, establish China as a key partner for economic development and for providing technology. The telecoms aspect of that is quite important because with China, if you're a developing country, China is a partner who can give you high quality technology, whether that's in telecoms, renewable energy, AI, and do it cheaply and without any strings attached in terms of how your government works and things like that. So that's very attractive for countries who want to develop quickly and not have to go through all of the same stages of industrialization and so on that other countries have.
That probably kind of leads us back to the UK, doesn't it, in some way? Because we started going down that path, didn't we, of using Chinese materials in our telecommunications network, and then we kind of got cold feet about it.
Yes, and I mean that was partly due to American pressure on the UK to not adopt Huawei, but the sort of concern, I mean, well, two concerns with it. One concern is also a legitimate concern for the UK, and that is if you're adopting sort of digital technologies that are used for telecoms and things like that, those technologies can also be used for, they collect data, they can be used for surveillance, and if you rely on any sort of kind of foreign power for the provision of something really crucial like the telephone network or something like that, or the mobile network, in theory, the Chinese government could pressure Huawei to switch it off if they wanted to. Now, they probably wouldn't do that outside of a war or something, but the potential is there. And that's true regardless of whether it's China or not. But obviously, if it's a friendly country, there's much less risk of something like that. But the other concern, and this is the sort of the key US concern, is with Chinese technology basically helping China to gain more and more influence, enhancing its global power. And the US has a unique interest in China not doing that because the US wants to remain the most powerful country economically and militarily and so on, and technologically. That sort of thing is no longer, I think, a key priority for a country like the UK. China's a lot bigger than us. They're economically much stronger than we are. It will not be long before they overtake us in most areas of technology. They have in certain areas already. So, the question for us has got to be one of national security concerns matter, but so do economic opportunities and technological opportunities. And there is a question there actually for other US allies as well of when it comes to China, actually our interests will increasingly diverge from those of the United States.
So I feel like every couple of years, a politician in the UK suggests getting closer to China as a bit of a solution to some of our geopolitical problems. I think David Cameron did it in the sort of coalition years, and then the latest is Rachel Reeves. And then you'll have politicians like Ian Duncan Smith, who is always arguing against that and warning of the dangers. Do you think he's right to be worried about that?
I mean, again, this kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning about the polarization. It's either straightforward economic opportunities or terrible human rights and oppression, and both are kind of true. There are certainly, I think, very legitimate concerns about human rights. There are the questions of human rights within China, and those are completely legitimate, particularly things like the policies that the Chinese government has adopted towards the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang, the Turkic Muslim minority who were sort of subjected to these sort of re-education camps, children taken away from their parents and things like that. That sort of thing, obviously, is not something that's kind of amenable to our value system in a country like the UK. And there are a couple of questions there. I think one question is, can you influence what China actually does in China? I think if you're the UK, not really, frankly. But what you can do, and this is where those criticisms I think sort of have legitimacy when it comes to UK policy. What you can do is say, well, in the UK, we don't want products that might have been made through Uyghur slave labor, for example. Yeah. And then that actually is something where there's a real potential for building policy on that. What you have to then do, though, is think about how do you weigh that up against the jobs and investment that could be created by a Chinese EV company like BYD setting up a manufacturing plant, for example. I don't think there's any plans for that to happen, but it's a sort of a hypothetical. And that's not an easy choice. that's really difficult because you're dealing with a government in China that will, make very clear how unhappy it is if you do criticize what it sees as its internal affairs. And that might do things like, scupper the possibility of a deal like that. So I think, in the UK, like as in Europe as well, we're struggling still to work out how to work productively with China while also sort of being firm about the things that we don't like.
So you're suggesting that there's possibly some kind of middle way that allows us to benefit from some of those opportunities.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think it's important to take a hard line on sort of what matters to the UK, what matters in terms of what we care about in terms of things like political freedoms and things like that. And we should be very, very concerned, and I think very straightforward in our criticism of things like China's intimidation of Hong Kong and Tibetan and Uyghur activists and Taiwanese activists who are in the UK, or Hong Kong British nationals overseas who have come over to settle in the UK and who are targeted by China, because that also, I think you can flip around China's argument and say, well, that's a violation of our sovereignty in the UK if you're trying to sort of extend your political oppression across UK borders. But it goes back to the same thing. Like ultimately, China is very big, and it's there, and it's not going away, and it will get bigger, and its economic impact and influence will get bigger. And the thing that I think actually we really need to be thinking about is, because China's got this combination of economic power, control of supply chains, massive manufacturing power. Its manufacturing output by value, I think, is equivalent to the next 9 countries put together. So it produces a huge amount of stuff, and it now is technologically competitive with the United States. What we have to think about is, what if they get to, high-level AI and robotics first, and they implement that across all of that manufacturing capacity and economic power, then you actually have a huge and very rapid, probably, increase in China's power and influence. And I mean, goes back to the point I made about the long view of Chinese history and the decline that China faced, partly when it encountered newly industrialized Britain. The British had sent a mission to China in the 1790s. So Britain becoming a powerful country, doing some interesting stuff with technology, sent an embassy to China, and the Chinese emperor said, basically, thank you very much, you're making some interesting stuff, fine, well done you, but we're not interested. And I think, if you'd had a Chinese observer in the UK in the 1790s, they probably would have said something like the sort of things that we might say if we go to China today, like, oh, this is quite interesting. They're going places, but they're not there yet. We're still ahead. It only took 4 decades for that to be completely reversed. And I think we should take seriously the possibility that something like that could happen with China today, but in the other direction. Which isn't to say that's going to happen, but we should be thinking about, what do we do if? And then we will have to have a better way of engaging with China and thinking about how we can protect our interests while also benefiting from keeping up with Chinese technology and things like that, which will require having quite a good relationship with China.
So the other kind of card it has in its back pocket, I suppose, is it does hold huge quantities of US debt, doesn't it? So even if they started kind of margin selling small amounts of that debt, they could really disrupt American capital markets, couldn't they?
Yeah. I mean, one of the big problems facing, it's both a problem and a benefit to both of them. Facing both China and America is that they're hugely interdependent on each other. And you've got this sort of trade war ramping up again with Trump. Both countries have huge capacity to damage the other through that economic interdependence. But at the same time, they have been taking steps to kind of de-risk from each other. Ultimately, I think that's going to be more the trend is going to be both sides, China and America, increasingly trying to de-risk and decouple whilst also maintaining this intensifying competition. And that's concerning. That should concern most countries for different reasons. I mean, if you're a small country in East Asia, that's concerning because, there could be a war over Taiwan or over the South China Sea. But for a country in Europe or a country like the UK, it's also concerning because we could get caught in the middle. And especially now that in the US you have an administration that's much more transactional and much more willing to be transactional with close allies. That is worrying because that means that actually, what the UK does in relation to China might incur costs imposed by the Americans, for example, and vice versa. And there needs to be a way to navigate that, especially for a country like the UK that's very dependent on America as well.
Well, I found that absolutely fascinating. That's been really, really good, William. Thank you so much for sharing your very deep and wide knowledge with us. I'm sure listeners will be really feel that they know so much more than they did half an hour ago.
Culture Club?
Culture Club, yeah.
Okay, so I'm coming empty-handed to Culture Club once again.
Yes.
Don't tell me off.
I won't tell you off.
But I believe you both have something to share. So, Hilary, tell us what you're bringing to Culture Club.
Yeah, so last week I went to the meeting of the Manchester Lit and Phil. Do you know what that is?
Literature and philosophy?
That's right,
okay.
Yeah. So I think quite a lot of northern towns still have a Lit and Phil society.
Okay.
And they had a meeting on the renovation of Manchester Town Hall. So I don't know if you've been to Manchester, William. Have you been to Manchester?
Yes. Yeah, I've been a few times, yeah.
Okay, so there's the big Gothic town hall built in the kind of 1870s by Waterhouse, the architect, who also did the National History Museum, I think, and the Prudential buildings on Holborn. You can kind of spot his style. And they started a project in 2017 to renovate the town hall. And you'll know, Sebastian, that if you go past the town hall now, it's kind of wrapped up in all this scaffolding and curtaining.
It has been since I moved to Manchester over 3 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've still never seen it.
Okay. Well, obviously 2020 and COVID and everything knocked the timetable a bit, but I think they are still hoping we might get to see it again in 2027, maybe.
2027?
Yeah, still a lot to do.
Here, I thought it said 2024 it was going to open. And then
they did say 2024, and then there's two things that happened. One is COVID, and the second is, although they had all the original plans from Waterhouse, what they've found is they've kind of taken down facades and taken down some of the things that were added, later on, is that he kind of changed his plans all the time. And so things aren't quite as they thought they were. They have moved 10 tons of statues, including statues of people like Jewel and what's the guy who has colour blindness? Dalton.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. They have...
Daltonico, you remember that?
Daltonico, yeah, I do. I remember.
It's how you say colourblind in other languages. So in Spanish, daltónico, I believe.
What's colourblind in Chinese, William?
What is colourblind?
Do you know?
Oh no, you put me on the spot. I actually don't know, but
yeah.
So,
it's okay.
Dalton something.
Yeah. They've taken up 4,000 metres of mosaiced corridors.
Okay.
Wow.
including lots of bees, 67 bees apparently. And they have removed about 100 paintings. The biggest one is the painting of the Cotton Famine Relief Committee. So I'm thinking that would have been around the time of the when we're having trade wars on cotton. Yeah. So it's a massive job, and the kind of scale of it is just so enormous. So you kind of think about what things in the town hall. There are all the leaded windows, which all have to be taken out and replaced, and they're keeping everything that they can. There's all the stonework. There's the curtains. There's the light fittings. So all of these things need to be taken down, rescued if they can. So they're trying to keep as much as they can.
But what are they actually doing to it?
So they are making it accessible. They are making it into a public building that can be used by people more effectively. But it will also still have a lot of the kind of normal town hall functions in it as well. So it will still have those things that you normally expect to find in a town hall in there. So, what they want to do is make it a workable building. So things like making things accessible. Waterhouse had this idea that you had to have 11 steps at every entrance. So you have to find a way to make every entrance accessible, and that's tricky. So one of the things they've done is they put a platform lift in the statue hall, which you won't have seen, will you? But there's a fantastic kind of marble statue hall on the ground floor, and they've put in this platform lift between two pillars, and the mosaic that they took out from underneath the platform lift, they have reinstalled as the kind of flooring in the platform lift.
That's cool.
So that is, I think some of these things are fantastic. And they've kind of trained hundreds of people in things like stonework and fabric restoration. And apparently the idea is that everybody imagines that all these workers are now going to go off to the Houses of Parliament to be involved in that project, because there's been so much training on, old, original crafts and skills that can be used there. So I thought it was just a fantastic project, and there's been lots of presentations given to the public. We'll put in the show notes a kind of link to the website where you can watch some of the slideshows that show you some of the fantastic work they're doing. So I guess the thing that to me it says is that civic pride, which I think we've talked about a lot, haven't we, is something that is really important. And these kind of big old buildings that have probably in a lot of towns fallen into disrepair, a kind of project to restore them, that those buildings can be part of a project to restore that pride. So I kind of wanted to give it a bit of a shout out as being something that I thought was a really good project.
Nice. Okay, William, tell us what you've got.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to put in a plug for the noble hobby of playing war games with small painted toy soldiers. This is something of a passion of mine. It's a very good way to sort of meet some other people who are geeky about either history or sci-fi or things like that. And it's something that's going through a bit of a sort of renaissance, I guess. At the moment, we've got some really good companies in the UK, like Games Workshop, who make the Warhammer games, Warlord games, who make sort of various historical games, with kind of thriving sort of communities of hobbyists growing up around them, and it's nice because it's a way of, I mean, what you do is you pick a genre, sci-fi or something, or a historical period that you like. You buy yourself a little army of soldiers, you paint them. So that's quite nice. It's quite creative like that. But then, you go and basically you'll have a set of rules and you fight battles against people, but you do it in person, which is quite nice because it's, I think, certainly for people who, I mean, I guess, there's like, I where sort of when I was at school and so on, like this is when sort of video games were sort of coming in, becoming more accessible and so on. I would play some of these video games, but there's something about that that's quite distant. You're not engaging with another person. You're not doing anything sort of tactile. Whereas these games are, they're analog, in person. You're moving your troops around the board, uh, and yeah, you're playing against another person, and that's funny. You've got a sort of a shared interest, and you can go along and because both of you have got this interest, you know what you're doing, you've got the game as a sort of way to interact. You don't necessarily have to even have met each other before. You can just sort of go along, pick up a game at the local club or something, and play. And I find that really sort of enjoyable as something kind of relaxing. You'll probably have got from sort of some of the stuff I was talking about earlier. I'm quite interested in sort of things like strategy and stuff like that. That's an element of this kind of thing. And it's I found especially with playing historical games, that's a really nice way to kind of learn a bit more about history. So I'm painting a lot of English Civil War figures at the moment, and that's been a really really good sort of motivation to read up on the history of the English Civil War. Really fascinating period, one that I didn't know much about before I got into it through doing this.
Which side are your soldiers on?
With history.
Which side are your soldiers on?
Well, so part of the problem of the hobby is it's very addictive, and I have both. You buy one.
It's a good way of not coming down on one side or the other.
So the ones that I've kind of are sort of furthest on the way to completion are parliamentarians from the early part of the war. So.
Okay, interesting. So I when you were talking about video games, I thought of something that was so my eldest brother and I would play a lot of video games together. It was a great way of socializing. It was just spending time together, immersed in a hobby, and we found that as the years progressed, games developers were making fewer and fewer games that you could play split screen. And I thought to myself, if I was Prime Minister, I would mandate it that any new game there would have to be a split screen function. Because it encourages people to play together in the same room. It's completely different than playing online, I think.
I'm going to ask the obvious question. Is this just a boy thing?
Doesn't have to be, I would say. I would say it can be an inclusive hobby, but I'd say the reality is it has a certain demographic slant, you might say.
I suspect
it could be a boy thing, couldn't it? Yeah.
I do remember painting the little men with my two boys. I've got two boys, and with my two older nephews. And the younger nephew was asking me the other week, have we still got any of that Warhammer stuff? So I did have a route through the boxes in the loft, but I sadly couldn't find any.
But there you go. That's a very good example of a good British company that's doing well. And from what I hear from people in the Young Social Democrats, that it's doing well all over the world because people are interested in this sort of stuff. I haven't got into it, so maybe it's something to explore. But there you go. Thank you, William, for coming on and sharing with us your knowledge.
Are we going to do Chinese Culture Club?
Chinese Culture Club?
Yeah. So, William, you also had a kind of Chinese concept you were going to mention. Do you want to do that? What's Chinese for Culture Club? Sorry, I'm throwing all these at you, aren't I? Now?
So culture would be something like 文化俱乐部.
Okay.
I guess.
We just wanted to hear some Chinese, didn't we?
We did, yeah. Okay, great.
The thing I wanted to mention was, so as I said before, I did some research in China, some academic research on Chinese religion. Actually, this was, I guess, in about 2013, 2014. And what I was looking at there was sort of popular, what you might call popular religion. So sort of what people would do day to day. And I got to know a lot of people by doing that research, including various other people, like people who set up local businesses, people who did things like, there was this little restaurant that I used to go to where there was a group of retired men who basically set it up and they played folk music there and so on. And a common thread to all of this stuff is a concept in Chinese called minjian, which translates as something like among the people or between the people. And the reason I wanted to mention it is because I think it's quite a useful concept to think about. Because in China, you have the Chinese Communist Party is everywhere. It's in big businesses, it's in the workplace, it runs the country, obviously. And that means that actually there's not a lot of space for any kind of independent civil society or independent kinds of organizations like that outside the remit of the party, or business, but the business also with party involvement. So what people do is they try to find a space and carve out a space themselves, and that's what this word minjian kind of refers to. It's all of these spaces where actually the party and the state and big business and so on can't quite reach, but where all these aspects of kind of traditional culture and community are kept alive. And I think that's a very useful and quite a heartening concept, including for us in the West, where obviously we're not run by a sort of all-pervasive communist party, but I think we do live in a society increasingly where not much exists that you don't have to pay for or consume, or don't have to get a permit to do something or something like that. And I think reclaiming that kind of space is very valuable. So there's a room for that sort of between the people space, or I don't know, space of the people, you might call it. I think in the UK as well.
So would folk be a good word to describe the same kind of feeling?
Yeah. So I think it would. But the other thing that, and a lot of the stuff that comes under this label in China is sort of stuff that you might call folk, like folk music, folk traditions, folk festivals. The other thing though that I sort of thought about in relation to this was, so my wife and I have an allotment near where we live, and that to me is something that is very minjian, because I mean, okay, you pay a nominal fee and so on, but you don't have to pay a lot. It's this kind of preserved space where you've got people who are, they're doing this thing that they've been doing or people have been doing for decades, centuries, even if you want to be more sort of abstract with it. And it's just its own space. It's not trying to be anything bigger. It's not trying to be something political. It's not trying to do something for profit. It's just people interested in growing vegetables, and they all turn up there and they talk to each other. They get to know each other. It creates a little community, and it happens without the need for intervention by some kind of big, abstract, organized thing.
Oh, I'm so excited by this now because, Sebastian, don't you, that I do gardening club down at my local park, and a lot of the Hong Kong refugees come and help us. They volunteer with us. So I'm going to use that word to describe what we do in gardening club.
Would it be the same in Cantonese?
Oh.
It's the only
problem.
problem.
I don't know what it would be in Cantonese. The characters would be the same.
Okay, well, there you go. Got to write it
down and send it to you.
So I love when you discover a word that you already know the concept for, and whilst you were describing that concept, I felt it. I know what that is, that minjin. I've seen it in many parts of the world where you see often in Sicily, where like the men would play cards together out in the park. Yeah. It's like there was no politics, involved in that. They're just playing cards, and I feel it certainly in what we're doing with the SDP, that you do need to get away and you need to experience the real purpose of life, which is the gardening club, the allotments, the playing cards in the park. So I think that's amazing, yeah.
And culture club.
And culture club.
That's what culture club's all about, I think. Yeah. So great. That was an extra special edition, Chinese Culture Club.
Yeah. Right, so thank you very much, William. It was a pleasure to speak to you and learn a bit about a very, very important country that is a very powerful country, and that one that we in the UK probably should start thinking seriously about. And I think that's it. There's nothing else to say other than go and like and share and
Yes,
do all
please.
of that.
Yeah.
And join us tomorrow for the news section.
Great. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.